to another episode of the TLDR podcast. I'm Zach Michaelis, TLDR's editor-in-chief, and today I'm joined, well, almost as always, by our two writers, Ben Blissett and Rory Taylor. How are we doing today?
Good.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Good week.
Yeah, good week.
Yeah.
Any reason?
Just good vibes.
Good,
You know?
good to hear.
Yeah. I'm trying to be positive because it's going to be another episode where actually the subject is probably quite bleak overall.
Okay, well, good effort.
Yeah.
So, as Rory sort of alluded to there, obviously we're going to be talking about Israel in the main section of this video. We're going to specifically be talking about the European Union, or rather, let's just say Europe's response to the Gaza War. But before we get into that, we have to do our underreported stories. So, again, we're going to start with Rory. What is your underreported story for the week?
I've kind of got a two-parter for this one. So the first part is King Charles has been on a trip to Kenya.
I saw that.
And he did a speech where he expressed regret about the actions of the British during Kenya's path to independence, but didn't apologise. And the second part is the German president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, has been in Tanzania, which was formerly a German colony. A similar kind of visit to Charles, but in his case, he did actually make an official apology to the Tanzanian people for Germany's role back in, I think there was an uprising in the early 1900s that was suppressed by the Germans. So he made a formal apology there. So I think it's interesting. I mean, these are things that come up every now and then, especially for the British, where there was this huge empire and lots of people that if you know King Charles wanted to apologise to, there'd be a long list of people to apologise to. It's interesting that these two visits happened at the same time, but kind of went different ways. One with this official apology, and one just kind of keeping one step back from an apology, really.
It was interesting, wasn't it? Because the statement that Charles, this is such a non-TLDR topic, but the statement that Charles put out, or rather articulated, was it was so impassioned in its regret. It was an apology without the word sorry.
Well, this is what I find really interesting, because the German president's speech, he never said, "I apologise," or "I am sorry," or "we are." The phrase he said is, as Germany's federal president, I want to ask forgiveness for what Germans did to your forefathers. And I guess asking for forgiveness is kind of an apology, but it also doesn't feel like an actual apology.
Why do you think they stopped short of an apology?
I think effectively it's because they worry that if they do actually apologise, then there'll be like some kind of legal way that the people they're apologising to can say, well, you owe us this amount of money for what you did.
Like when you get in a car crash and you're not supposed to apologise for legal reasons.
Yeah, pretty much.
I think that's part of it. I also think there's a political... I mean, I'm sure that is actually probably the main thing, but I do think there's this... the king has playing a delicate political game because, you know, monarchs are fundamentally political and monarchs do have eyes on their approval ratings. And he's got to simultaneously... Like, he is quite... Left-wing is too strong, but like he's quite a, let's just say, modernising monarch. No, he's got to focus on like environmental things, and he's doing this sort of like tour of all the former colonies and coming near an apology for them.
Yeah.
I think he's quite modern in his instincts, the political instincts, but at the same time, I think he has to try and make sure he doesn't upset, you know, the contingent of the British public that would see an apology as sort of like giving in to the woke lefties, you know, like the Daily Mail readers.
Yeah, and I suppose from his perspective, he probably genuinely believes that he personally doesn't have something to apologise for. Like he can express his own personal sorrow at what happened, but if he doesn't think, because he wasn't personally involved, if he doesn't think that, then does he think he has the right to apologise? If that makes any sense.
I think he probably does insofar as he can apologise on behalf of the royal family.
Exactly.
But this is the most we've, as TLDR, ever squeezed out of a royal topic. Yeah. That's quite well.
It's true.
Okay, Ben.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking at another UK story this week, which is the COVID inquiry.
Sorry, I shouldn't sound so bored. It's a very you story.
It is. But I think it's important. They're taking evidence this week from a number of different key figures at the time, and it's painting a quite a clear picture now of the chaos that the government found itself in when they first saw COVID spreading through, for example, the Italian healthcare system before we locked down. It also shows, we sort of knew this before as a character trait from Johnson. He sometimes takes a little while to come to a decision, but it was quite shocking to see, you know, a number of different figures pointing out that how frustrating it was that they sort of felt that they reached a conclusion that we either should lock down or shouldn't lock down, and then the next day, U-turned and just constantly did that. And it's really painting a picture, because this isn't, it's not Labour people coming out and saying this isn't a partisan attack. These are people who dedicated their time working with Boris Johnson, working for the government, for the lockdown strategy, and it's painting just a very clear picture now of what it was like at the time.
And we got some incredible quotes.
We did.
I think you are allowed to say them on the podcast.
Yeah. So most of them came from Dominic Cummings, and he's been accused of using violent and misogynistic language, specifically directed at Helen McNamara, who is the deputy cabinet secretary. So he called her I presume we're going to bleep this, but he called her a and he also, this is where he got accused of the misogyny. He referred to her, I think, stilettos or something, and it was just some quite distasteful language and some quite distasteful sort of imagery that he was trying to paint here.
That obviously is pretty unpalatable, but there also were some quite fun quotes about Tory ministers, no?
Yes, yeah, and the interesting thing was he was then asked about this in committee, and he was asked about the language, and it was sort of an uncomfortable, it's quite an uncomfortable thing when he was reading all these out, and then they came back to him, and he said,
But what were they reading out?
I don't know the exact quotes. Presumably you do?
No, I think there was something like fuck pig.
That was fuck pig, that was one of them. Yes, he referred to them as fuck pigs, called a variety of people, and when he was out, he had, it was what was intended to be an embarrassing moment, I presume, at committee for him, where they read these quotes out and said, do you regret using these? And said, I kind of regret the language, but ultimately a lot of people thought I was reflecting a wider view at the time. And I think he tried to explain it as unpalatable as that phrasing was. What's more unpalatable was the actions of these people that I was criticising, effectively. But anyway, the point is, as interesting as all that is, and as much as that has done its rounds on Twitter, there is a serious element to this as well, which is, the number of people that obviously lost their lives in COVID, and the chaos, the abject chaos that has now been made clear of the government at the time, even from people who worked within it. Lee Kane, Dominic Cummings, Helen McNamara, all of the key figures at the time are now coming out and saying how near impossible the working conditions were.
No, you're right to remind us that even though it was a long time ago and the headlines have been dominated by these entertaining Dominic Cummings quotes, it is appalling quite how chaotic government was at that time, and all of the sort of worst cliches that we heard about it and sort of caricatures were actually true.
I think the levity of it is useful in the sense that it keeps it in the news cycle, and it is a way of hooking people back into the story. But ultimately, the end goal of that has to be, remembering that this was, one of the most serious crises this country has faced. 225,000 people in this country lost their lives. And it's to do with the government response to that, and their failure at times to come to a clear decision and make a clear decision. So I think that's. I think it's been well reported. I think the bit that's underreported is the more serious element of it. So I think that was the point I was trying to raise.
It is also just in a way more bad news for Sunak, because it's yet another week of headlines filled with stories about Tory incompetence. And even though Sunak himself sounds like one of the more sensible members of the cabinet, the sort of vibe is that the Tories are useless. Remember, the Tories are still useless. No?
Yeah, I do want to return to this later. There's elements of this I don't entirely agree with in terms of how it affects Sunak.
Interesting.
Anyway, so my underreported story is, I think it wouldn't normally be underreported, but it was sort of covered over by Israel stuff. It's a visit by Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi to Washington at the very end of October. And that was accompanied by some really quite optimistic rhetoric on his part. He was talking about the importance of cooperation, reopening a strategic dialogue, all that sort of thing. And this might not feel that important. I mean, it seems sort of almost like trivially true that the two greatest powers should have dialogue with one another. Like we had that sort of bare minimum during the Soviet Union. But it is worth sort of psychologically reminding yourself quite how dire things were at like the end of 2022, just after Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. And it's there's a lot of reporting that's come out since, and obviously because it's been delayed, it hasn't really hit the headlines. But there's a guy called Edward Luce in the Financial Times and Adam Tooze, who works at Columbia University, and they were talking about how they were hearing serious, credible reports from American generals at that time that 2025 was like, that's when we're going to be at war with China. And, you know, that's a terrifying idea. That was sort of like that was the base case in parts of Washington. And it is really good to see that bit by bit there has been a sort of rapprochement. I think it's important not to overstate this. I think it's important to make sure that, you know, this isn't like they're becoming best mates, but at a bare minimum, opening a strategic dialogue and sort of like restarting cooperation in really obvious policy areas. I mean, like there was some talk about cooperating on Israel and Gaza. There's also been some talk about cooperating on climate. That's just good for the world, and we're probably not going to make it through the century without those two cooperating, in at least to a minimal degree.
Yeah, isn't Xi Jinping is possibly going to San Francisco for a Pacific Leaders Summit or something? I think, and they might meet with Biden then. Which will
There's still being negotiated, so the Biden-Xi meetings hasn't quite been finalised. I think Wang Yi and Antony Blinken are supposed to be sort of like talking out the conditions for it to happen.
Yeah.
But I think, again, it sounds like, and it is the bare minimum in a sense, but it's nonetheless a really quite significant improvement on the state of play at the end of 2022. Okay, so with all that said, let's get into the second part of this video, and we're going to be talking about Israel because, well, I mean, like, what else would you talk about? But specifically, and I do think this is an interesting, actually in some sense, underreported element of the conflict, at least for Europeans. Europe's, let's just say, confused response to the Israel crisis. So before I ask you a question, I think I just want to like set the stage, and you could immediately see the divisions within Europe within the first few days of the conflict, because you had the European Commission a couple of days after the October 7th attacks saying that they were going to cut all aid to Palestine. You had von der Leyen going to Israel and talking to Netanyahu and saying, you know, you have the absolute right to self-defense, and not really mentioning human rights or like international law. And then, let's just say like a couple of days after that, you had a whole load of EU countries, including perhaps most notably Spain, Ireland, Luxembourg, pushing back against the decision to cut Palestinian aid. And then a bit later, you had literally hundreds of European Union staffers penning a letter essentially complaining about the way von der Leyen has handled this. And that's for two reasons. I mean, one, it's that they don't agree with her sort of like quite absolutist support for Israel, but it's also because it's not clear what von der Leyen's remit is in this respect. Like, is she acting outside of the scope of her powers? And so we haven't really got past this. These divisions still maintain. But what do you think the state of play is at the moment?
I think now we're a few weeks out from October the 7th now.
Nearly a month,
and now we've had weeks of Israel's response, and we're getting to the point now where the immediate response was condemnation of the attack, but it is all the focus now is on how is Israel responding, and how can we, or how can Europe kind of alleviate the suffering that's going on at the moment and kind of find some kind of peaceful resolution. And I think you mentioned von der Leyen's remit there. I think that is a really interesting thing, because she, you know, the European Commission in theory is not in theory, it is the executive arm of the European Union, but you have to remember it's 27 member states that struggle to agree on most things. And when we think about Russia and Ukraine, they were pretty remarkably united on that front. But when it comes to Israel and Palestine, you've got some countries that are really strongly in support of Israel, and then you've got others like Ireland, which have a lot more historic kind of support for Palestine. And as time goes on, and as the focus moves on to Israel's response, I think those divisions are becoming even more clearer and clearer. I don't really know where it goes from here, but I think a lot of it, as much as the European Union wants to be kind of independent and its own decision, have its own decisions made by itself, it kind of comes down to what Joe Biden wants to do. I think it's a huge moment if maybe when Joe Biden kind of moves towards calling for a ceasefire of some kind. I think if that ever happens, then the EU will, and the UK. But I think a lot of it depends on what happens in Washington, basically.
I think you're right. I think that's entirely correct in that because I think in some ways it's a symptom of Europe's own internal confusion. Without a coherent response, there's no independence, and they just end up sort of accidentally, passively falling behind the US. But I think there is at least a possible universe where Europe realizes that sometimes European and American strategic interests coincide. Like Ukraine is a good example of that. They really did neatly map onto one another. Both the Europeans and the Americans wanted to defeat Russia. But Israel is this really interesting case, and actually almost all conflict in the Middle East follows this pattern, where European and American interests really sharply divide. And I think what makes this asymmetry even starker is the fact that Europe has no power in the Middle East. And America does. And it's this weird fact where America gets to decide what happens in the Middle East, but is entirely insulated from the consequences. So just talking about to flesh that out a little bit, I mean, a really obvious one at the moment is migration. One of the reasons that a lot of Europeans are anxious about what's happening in the Middle East is that they know that if we get further destabilization, that could be another wave of immigration. And leaving aside the sort of like moral question about immigration, whether it's good or bad, European politicians know that European publics are not keen on that. And so they're worried about that. And the Americans are less fussed. But the other one is energy. And this is a marked difference from 1973. But the Europeans really, really need the Middle East for energy. We need them for oil. We need Saudi Arabia for oil. We need all those countries for oil. But also gas. Qatar is the world's biggest gas producer. We're trying to move towards gas as part of the energy transition. Both Italy and France, I don't know if you saw, signed 27-year contracts with Qatar to supply them with gas. And we can't, this is obviously like, it's not a distant hypothetical, but it's not going to happen anytime soon necessarily. But if, as happened in 1973, the Arab states decide to impose an energy embargo on the West, because they're supporting Israel, then Europe just can't afford that. But again, America is insulated from that because America has its own domestic oil production. And again, that's very different from the 70s when actually America did rely on the Saudis for oil. But America now has enough of its own oil and gas via shale and fracking that it won't really be affected. And again, you did see that in Ukraine and Russia, in that there was this massive asymmetry in how the two countries were affected when there was a sort of war-related disruption to energy supplies. And so I think you're right that Europe will probably just end up following suit with America. But I do think there's a world in which Macron wins his argument about European strategic autonomy and goes like, guys, this is just not in our interest. It really is in our interest. We are losing favour with the global south. We're at risk of another migration crisis, which politically we can't afford, again, leaving aside the ethics of it. And we're at risk of another energy crisis in a time when our economies are already stagnating, And I think there was a universe where he convinces enough of Europe to be like, actually, we do have to get off the fence here.
I think he is right on that. And I think a lot of people probably would agree with him that should be the case for Europe, but it just isn't the case now. And I mean, on the subject of Macron, you see kind of the limits of France's ability to kind of dictate policy when he was there saying, let's get an international force in Gaza to defeat Hamas like we did with ISIS. Obviously not going to happen.
But I think that is such an interesting... So that is such an interesting point because when that happened, you're right, it was met with ridicule. Everyone would be like, oh, big picture thinker Macron, you come with a nice silly idea for his foreign policy. And there's an element of truth to that. But I think there's worth saying two things. The first is that there have been reports, and I think the New York Times made the Washington Post in the last week or so, that the Americans themselves are talking to the Israelis and saying, what is the end game for Gaza? Maybe it's an international coalition that goes in. And that's different from Macron's idea. Macron was saying instead of the Israeli Defense Forces, we go in as an international coalition. And they're saying afterwards. But
is that like
is
that like a peacekeeping mission to kind of govern Gaza afterwards, or is it to go in and fight?
No, it's to govern Gaza afterwards. But Macron's idea presumably wasn't to go in and fight either. I mean, it might have been to go in and suppress Hamas a little bit, but it's not going to be like an IDF-style invasion of Gaza City.
Fleshed out.
But neither of the ideas are fleshed out. The point I'm trying to make is that Macron's idea was met with ridicule, and there was like, oh, the French thinking that they're still big players in the world, and then the Americans say it, and everyone's like, that's a serious idea. That's clever. Interesting. I mean, there's a point there in that the Americans could do it and the French can't. But I think that's really interesting. And the other thing is that it's very easy to ridicule that idea, but what are the alternatives? Whenever you follow this chain of reasoning through, what basically asks what happens next in Israel, you end up with just terrible outcomes all across the board. And it might be that this, as ridiculous an idea as it sounds, is the least bad option. And I think he made a political mistake in announcing it when he did, and in such a sort of laissez-faire way.
I think it was when he went to Israel.
Yeah, so it must have been like the 12th, 13th October, something like that. Maybe
pretty soon after.
Yeah. and yeah, because it was ripe for ridicule. It was too soon, essentially. But it's not necessarily a terrible idea. And so I think it is interesting watching like how this affects the European-American relationship. And I think if Macron played his cards right, this would be a real point in his favour. You know, this is a really good way of making the case for strategic autonomy.
Yeah.
And I think the other reason, by the way, that this makes the case for strategic autonomy is that it might just be that America can't afford 3 wars, you know, and if Republicans, you already see this in the House of Representatives, in that they are trying to get a bill exclusively for Israel war funding and not Ukraine war funding. It might just be that the Republicans decide. I mean, Joe Biden is obviously committed to Ukraine, but they can't do Israel, Taiwan, and Ukraine, and we're just going to do Israel and Taiwan.
Yeah.
And that's something that the Europeans have been worrying about. But this is really forcing America's hand here. It's making America make a decision. And Janet Yellen, is she the Treasury Secretary?
Yeah.
Am I right about that?
Yeah.
She said this amazing thing when she was asked, you know, can we afford 2 wars? Of course we can. Of course we can afford 2 wars. Yeah.
I think some interviewer asked Biden a similar thing, and he said, you know, we're the richest country in the goddamn world. Of course we can. But it's pretty bleak when you think about when they're asked, can you afford other things, you know, healthcare or like
statement.
Poverty alleviation.
That should be my Underreported Story.
Yeah.
Sorry. It's an amazing statement. And there's actually been internal memos that have been leaked, I think, the New York Times, saying from the White House, telling journalists, and it's good for the economy. You have to sell it as being good for the economy. We're going to get American jobs in arms manufacturing.
But historically, post-war, post-Second World War, America getting involved in foreign conflicts, especially ones that don't have a quick and easy resolution, do end up, you know, like Vietnam's a great example of that, where it seems on the surface that it's something they should be able to solve pretty quickly and they have the military might to solve, but it ends up being lengthy, politically difficult and incredibly expensive.
I mean, Iraq and
Afghanistan and other great examples as well. But that it seems to portray a mild ignorance of post-World War II history.
It's also quite morally, it's just very, very, I don't know what the right word is. It's depressing to think that, like, yes, lots of people are dying, but like jobs and Lockheed Martin stock prices going up or whatever. Yeah. Like, it's not a good way of looking at the world, really, is it?
No, it's a slightly astonishing way of looking at the world, and it's slightly astonishing that that the White House can even get away with it in a way that you can even say with a straight face, we can afford 2 wars, probably 3.
Yeah.
What are you talking about? What does that even mean as like a statement?
Yeah.
And I as I say, I return to the, you know, as you were discussing earlier, there's no clear solution to the Israel, or there's no clear end goal for the Israel-Gaza crisis. And as I say, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, it was the same there, and they dragged on, cost tons, and ended up being, I mean, Iraq slightly different, but at least Vietnam and Afghanistan, you know, no clear end game with that.
No, I mean, I think you're right. I think this points to another thing that is true in both America and Europe, though, but I don't think has necessarily been true in the past, is that this is clearly going to be a war where the political appetite, or at least in, like, amongst the public, really wanes quite fast. I mean, polling already suggests that I think about 2/3 of Americans want a ceasefire. And this problem is especially acute for the Democrats, because if you go into presidential election with, you know, the most left-leaning part of the Democratic base thinking, I can't believe what Biden's done in Israel, supporting sort of genocide Israel. I'm not endorsing that viewpoint, I'm just articulating it. And then you have like a third candidate like Cornel West, you know, taking 5% of the vote. That's the end for Biden. That is another 4 years of Trump. And that's also true. You see that in a microcosm in the UK, where Starmer is realising that it's going to be very, very difficult for him to keep Muslim voters on side who'd normally vote Labour, while simultaneously trying to distance himself from Jeremy Corbyn and taking a harsh line on, well, again, basically a harsh pro-Israel line.
Yeah.
And again, it'll be true in like all European countries, in that European electorates have no appetite for a war in Gaza and would prefer a ceasefire. And there'll be increasing political pressure as time goes on for all the Western governments to sort of, to row back a little bit and basically try and get Israel to sue for peace.
I mean, a ceasefire, like we said, for basically every other outcome, it's hard to see like how it goes from there. I mean, a ceasefire would be one thing, but that's not the end result. A ceasefire is just one step in some future process that we don't know what direction it will go in. Yeah,
and Hamas is also worth saying, and this doesn't really have any import apart from just saying that there is no obvious solution. Is that Hamas have already said, or Hamas spokespeople have already said, that they won't respect the ceasefire. So,
and add to that Hezbollah and the Houthis and everyone else who is involved.
And the Lebanese president's current plan for, I mean, he's not going to get anywhere with it, but his current plan for peace.
They don't have a
Prime minister. Sorry, not they don't have a president.
Yeah.
And it's the guy who only runs about half the country anyway. Yeah. And he's saying that it's got a 3-step plan for peace. But the ceasefire is only the first step, and it's all contingent on if the ceasefire holds, which even he admits isn't likely. So, again, this goes back to this problem that it is just fundamentally intractable. Anyway, I think let's just try and go back to Europe a little bit, because I think we sort of drift off into a wider Israel conversation. So I think the whole von der Leyen saga points to this larger problem for the EU, which is that without a sort of like a centralized agent, the EU really struggles to come up with coherent responses to crises. And there was this sort of sense that Europe had found its geopolitical agency with Ukraine. But with Israel, with the sort of the benefit of hindsight and looking at Israel, the EU's apparent geopolitical agency does seem like a sort of historical contingency. It seems like a sort of reflection of the happy coincidence that we were all aligned on Ukraine. And the second that Europe finds its divisions again, all of a sudden that coherence and that agency collapses. Yeah. So, do you think basically this ties into this whole reform agenda with the EU, but do you think it's going to go anywhere?
I don't know is the obvious answer. But obviously the EU does have a foreign policy chief, Joseph Borrell. So he's a part of the European Commission, so under Ursula von der Leyen. Then you've got Charles Michel, president of the European Council. You've got these weird things where Ursula von der Leyen will go on a trip somewhere, maybe go and visit Joe Biden. Then 2 days later, Charles Michel will go there, and you kind of imagine Biden confused as to who's actually in charge. They both kind of insist that they are.
Yeah, and they don't get on those two. But in the past, when you've had it's a European Commission president and what's Michel? He's council president. Yeah. And in the past, when they did get on, I can't remember who the former presidents were, but they used to have those weird photo ops where they'd both shake a hand. Yeah. Do you remember these? So they go to meet a Japanese leader, and they'd each one be smiling, shaking a different hand. But go on.
Yeah, well, I think my point was basically that I don't know where it goes from there, because there's this kind of power struggle is probably too grand a term, but if you do want to consolidate foreign policy power or wider kind of power around one part of the European Union, the Council's going to want it, the Commission's going to want it, the Parliament's going to want it. It's very tricky.
Yeah,
well, I was going to say also, you've got the leaders of each European member state, they do vote on things and vote on policies and stuff, but when you have the immediate aftermath of a crisis, like with Israel and Gaza, you've got Ursula von der Leyen going over there, they're not voting on what she says when she's there. That's that person kind of in the moment saying what they think, which in theory should be speaking for the European Union, but that's effectively an impossible task.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's a sort of impossible problem for the EU, and I think some of it comes down to the fact that the EU was probably never really designed with foreign policy in mind, and both as the EU sort of becomes a geopolitical agent, but also just as foreign policy becomes more important in just politics generally, the EU really needs to sort of, that's such a stupidly useless term, but I was going to say it needs to sort itself out. But it needs to come up with sort yourselves out. Sounding very Nigel Farage there. But it needs to come up with a more coherent way of doing foreign policy. And I don't know what that is. Okay, so here we are with the Global Leaderboard. And again, let's start with Rory. Should we go? We normally go down first, don't we? And then we finish
start with a bad week.
Okay, so who's going down?
So I'm moving Joe Biden down from the very top rung. And this kind of ties into what we were talking about earlier. Going to bring it back to Israel and Gaza. There was some new polling done by the Arab American Institute about the view of Arab Americans or their opinion on how Joe Biden has responded to what's happening in Gaza. And effectively, I'm just going to read the line they wrote. Support for President Biden in the upcoming election has plummeted among Arab American voters, dropping from 59% to 17%. So that was 59% of that demographic voted for him in 2020, and now just 17% of that demographic is saying they would vote for him next time. There's millions of Arab Americans in the US, lots of them in Michigan, Pennsylvania, states that are pretty key to him winning re-election. He obviously hasn't been calling for a ceasefire. He's been pretty steadfast in his support for Ukraine.
Israel.
Sorry. And Ukraine, I suppose. Support for Israel, which has upset quite a lot of Arab Americans. which could be pretty bad for his re-election hopes, and also Democrats more widely. There was another, in that same polling, they looked at party affiliation or party identification among Arab Americans. It's always been, or the last 26 years they've been doing polling, Arab Americans have, or a majority of Arab, I really struggle to say it,
it's a lot
Arab
of A's.
Americans have identified as Democrats, whereas this was the first time that they polled them where Democrats weren't in the majority. It went to independents rather than Republicans.
Yeah, because I was going to say, sure, if you sort of disagree with Biden's stance, you can't really move to the Republicans. Or Trump
moving to Trump would be wild considering what he thinks about Israel.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the next year or so, well, however long the Israel situation plays out, will be pretty difficult for Biden.
You see something similar, by the way, in the UK, in that there's this, and very similar political dynamics, because there's this sort of antipathy or like upset with Starmer amongst parts of the sort of Labour voting base. They can't really move to the Tories because they've taken an even more pro-Israel stance. So sort of like, what happens? How does that
if they don't vote, that is bad news, but it's not as bad news as if they move to the Republicans, but have to wait and see.
Okay, Ben, who are you moving down?
I'm moving Hamza Youssef down.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because he's had a couple of defections this week to the Alba party.
Has he actually? I didn't notice that.
Ash
that should have been your
Regan,
Underreported. That's a good story.
defected to the Alba party, and it builds into this wider story of the SNP demise, and the fact that they're now, a previous leadership candidate has moved to the Alba party, which was started by Alex Salmond. Yeah. So it's not a great week.
No, I think he's been playing an interesting role politically. I mean, again, I saw some polling that basically backs up what you're saying, that he's really not popular. But for those people who don't know, he's the current First Minister, is that what you call him?
First Minister, yeah.
Yeah, basically the Prime Minister of Scotland. And his in-laws are currently stuck in Gaza. And it's sort of been an interesting, he's playing an interesting political role here. And it's also very interesting that it shows quite how powerless we are, that he can't get his in-laws out of Gaza. But nonetheless, you're right that things don't look good for the SNP. So sympathetic as we might be, unfortunately, he's down the ladder.
Yeah.
You'll probably get some people in the comments telling you pronounce Alba wrong. I don't know how you actually say it, but I know that is something that people pick up on. I don't know what it is, though.
No, I don't know either. My person going down, and it really could have been either Vivek Ramaswamy or DeSantis, but it's going to be Vivek Ramaswamy, and that is because the polling currently suggests that the sort of non-Trump candidate or the person who's second to Trump, is now Nikki Haley in the Republican primary.
Whoa.
A bit more of an establishment Republican. She has nonetheless said some pretty hawkish stuff, especially on foreign policy, that wouldn't be out of the Trump playbook. But yeah, I think it's bad news for them, and I think it's also in a sense maybe good news for the Republican Party. I think that Nikki Haley is almost definitely a stronger candidate than either of these two at a presidential election, but it's sort of redundant because Trump will almost definitely be the guy anyway. Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, that's fair.
Okay, Rory, who is going up?
Mine is my person who's had a good week is possibly controversial. Not possibly, it is controversial. Marine Le Pen, the leader of the National Rally in France. So my logic here is I've got two things. One, there's just been some recent polling where, again, she maintains a lead in the first round of the 2027 presidential election, around 31% in different polls, ahead of the... So Macron obviously can't run again, so a lot of polling companies, they just put his name in, assuming there'll be a Macronist candidate, or they'll put in someone like Edouard Philippe, who's kind of a possible Macron heir. But anyway, so Macron or a Macronist candidate around 26% in second place. So Le Pen is just maintaining this steady lead, and potentially, if that goes on, she'll get another shot at going to the second round, and then we'll have this big thing about can she win. The other thing is that I want to be careful how I phrase it, because I don't want to make the whole situation in Israel and Gaza about electoral politics and stuff. But it has provided an opportunity for her to kind of realign her party. In case people don't know, her party, National Rally, formerly National Front, founded and led by her father for decades, kind of synonymous with anti-Semitism in France under him, Jean-Marie Le Pen. He was convicted for like Holocaust denialism, effectively, and lots of things like that. She came out with a very strong pro-Israel statement after the October 7th attack, effectively saying that Israel must be allowed to eradicate Hamas. There are also some things going on the left, the French left, kind of in disarray over the situation in Gaza. You have this kind of pan-left-wing alliance that formed at the legislative elections last year, of everything from the communists to the kind of Jean-Luc Mélenchon's party and the more mainstream socialists. That is effectively dead now because of divisions over how to respond to this, which means they probably won't have a unified candidate in 2027, which splits the vote to the left and means they probably won't go into the second round, which is all kind of good news for Le Pen, I suppose. I think we probably could have touched on it earlier, but France, the impact of what's happening in Israel and Gaza on France is really interesting, because France has the largest Muslim population in Europe and is the world's third largest Jewish population,
and the largest in Europe.
Yeah,
that's the largest Jewish population.
Yeah,
as well, yeah.
So it's a real kind of tinderbox at the moment, and you've got Macron's government kind of trying to stay on top of it and be. Usually, Macron's government has always like shifted to the right when it comes to like immigration and that type of thing, trying to kind of stop votes bleeding away to the far right. And I think that will be the dynamic kind of going forward to 2027 as well.
All of that, well, we could have done a whole episode on what you just talked about. There's so many interesting things in there. I was going to say, the last point you made about the Macron thing, it does, I mean, again, I don't want to reduce Gaza down to like sort of domestic politics in Europe, but it does sort of explain why Macron has been more focused on peace than, let's say, like the UK or Germany or US, for example, because there are just more domestic risks to like a continuation of the conflict. The other thing, as I'm looking at Le Pen and Sarah Wagenknecht, and it's a sort of another data point for the rise of, I mean, she's not that left-wing economically, but she's definitely moved there. She moved there during the presidential election, which is still talking about the cost of living in France. Socially right-wing, but economically left-wing parties in Europe. And again, you know, those terms, again, are they that analytically useful? But you know what I mean? Like, that does seem to be a thing, and it does seem to be quite electorally successful. And the last thing I thought was really interesting was that you mentioned that she's been able to like sort of distance herself from the anti-Semitic past. I thought another interesting, similar like case in point there was Hungary, which was one of the few European countries to actively vote against the humanitarian truce that was suggested at the UN General Assembly, and has been really staunch support of Israel. And it's this, you know, Hungary, at least according to its critics, is a deeply anti-Semitic government. And it's focused a lot on George Soros, and it's sort of has done, at least some Hungarian politicians have, like reverted to anti-Semitic tropes to discredit Soros. But there's this sort of like authoritarians too strong, but like they're socially illiberal democracies, and they find an affinity there, and that sort of apparently overrides the questionable history. Ben, who's going up?
I think this is going to be a controversial one. I'm putting Rishi Sunak up one. Now, for two reasons. The first one is the COVID inquiry, I think, has focused very much on his predecessor, or second predecessor, Johnson. And I think that has taken quite a lot of media attention away from him. I also think that his obviously doing his AI summit this week, and he's managed to move the conversation onto a topic he's more comfortable talking about. It's obviously AI safety, that kind of thing. So it's sort of, all of these revelations about Johnson and the way the pandemic was handled, I think, is undermining this view amongst some Conservative MPs that Johnson should come back, or this Boris Johnson contingent. It sort of undermines that faction of the Conservative Party, and I think that strengthens Sunak's position. I know that there was what he's popped up in the COVID inquiry, but it's not been nearly as bad. I think he was criticised for at one point sort of opposing, I think, maybe the second lockdown because of the impact that it might have on the economy. But, if you compare that to the various criticisms of Johnson and his allies, I think that has sort of strengthened his position. And I also think, as I say, his AI summit has sort of moved the conversation away from, bad Conservative polling, by-election defeats, things like that, onto a topic he's more comfortable discussing. And yeah, he hasn't managed to get, major world leaders like Joe Biden, Olaf Scholz, Macron, etc. But he still had some notable figures, Elon Musk going there. And it probably won't help him too much. He's not a particularly popular figure in the UK. But, he's still got some other, foreign ministers, etc. to go along. And I think that the media attention on that, on the whole, will help him.
No, I think that's true. To be honest, it is one of the things that the UK does do well. We are turning into sort of the forerunners when it comes to international AI safety, which is to his credit. So the person who's going up for me, and it's partly because I just sort of want to fill this bit of the board up, is Nikol Pashinyan.
Whoa! I didn't think he'd get moved again after going on there.
But I saw him then. I thought, what are you doing this day? I'll give you a little Google. And it turns out he's doing okay. So I think the reason Pashinyan is doing okay is because, as most people will hopefully know, he is the Prime Minister of Armenia, and they suffered basically a military loss against Azerbaijan a couple of weeks back, when Azerbaijan took back its internationally recognised, to be fair, territory of, the Azerbaijanis call it Nagorno-Karabakh, and the Armenians call it Artsakh. And it forced the evacuation or the deportation, really, of about 100,000 Armenians living in the territory. But Pashinyan has had a good-ish last couple of weeks or so, both because it looks like he is nearing a peace agreement with Azerbaijan. And you might think, why they need a peace agreement? Surely Azerbaijan's won. That's true. But there is also this contested issue, what's called the Zangezur corridor, which is this sort of the southernmost part of Armenia, which connects the main bit of Azerbaijan to its Nakhchivan exclave. Yeah. And the reason that looks like it's going to hold, that the Azerbaijanis were under very little incentive to agree to a peace agreement given their sort of overwhelming military superiority, is because Pashinyan has negotiated a very tenuous but apparently sufficient defence agreement with the French, who have agreed to start selling him arms. And Macron has been lobbying other European leaders to basically bring Armenia into the European security network, as it were. So that's pretty good. And he's also somehow survived. So he's not popular.
Of a coup and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, because he gave up a big contested bit of territory. But he has apparently survived and looks like he'll be hanging on. I mean, this is really hostage to fortune because, if the Azerbaijanis invade the Zangezur corridor, or if he gets ousted sometime soon, like a pillock. But it's nice to have this bit.
We're gradually spreading the board out slightly.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that is everything. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much to Rory Taylor and Ben Blissett for all your insight. And we'll see you guys again next week.
Cool. See you next week.